So we're going to talk about magic, and we're going to talk about comic books. We're going to talk about sequential art. And the thing about comics is it's a medium that has shown us the ability to simulate time through juxtaposed spatial images. And we use it to create the illusion of becoming. This is similar to film, except it's not as restricted, because film is, of course, a railroaded sequence of images, but with a comic book, you have a whole field of play in which the eye can move across it. So there are things that the comic has in common with the tarot. Tarot is also sequential art. It has something in common with a map. The map is also terrain through which we move. We shift our attention and we pass through various different pathways. But the comic book typically is understood as being defined by its panels and by the way that it creates narratives in a linear fashion. But due to the fact that it is ultimately spatial, we have an extraordinary ability to play experiments with the medium of time itself. And I understand magic as the pressure of art brought to bear on time. And so in this presentation, we'll look at some of my comics and some of my works and some of my magic. And we'll talk about experimental time, and we'll talk about hyper objects, and we'll talk about all sorts of weird stuff. So have a look. Although I had worked with the comic medium sporadically as early as 2001 or 2002, I let it lie fallow for about a decade before I got serious about making comics. And it snuck up on me. It started really as just some play where I sat down with a pen and no plan, and I sketched out these two absurd little experiments, which aren't particularly esoteric, but they are experiments with the medium of comics. You can see that the panels blend into one another, shapes shift and change, and you have this idea of a overarching picture seen through various different frames. And so these are the starting point of my recent experiments, so which really started around 2016 with these sketches. So on the other end of the spectrum, we have these pieces, which some might argue are not comics as such. And why would they say that? Well, they lack one of the implicit markers that we recognize comics with, which is the panels. So they don't have a panel, and yet there are flows that move through them that allow time to be expressed. So from the lower left of the image with the mercurial crown, you can kind of move in a sort of arc or circuit up and around and down to the lower right. And similarly, you can explore the second image as if you were wandering through a terrain, and it gives you a lot of room. Now, this doesn't separate it from many other forms of art, of course, where we enter the pictorial space and we explore it through our own aesthetic choices. But this is related to comics in the sense that it's filled with discrete moments. And it points out another interesting feature of comics is that it marries them to a certain degree with the map. So the map is also a type of text that we read by surveying it and moving through it and finding pathways. So this type of work started to become a mapping of time. Now, to get what I mean by meta-sequentiality, let's look at sequentiality. So sequentiality or sequential art is a series of pictures that tell a story. And in the uppercase example, we have a set of standard square panels reading from left to right. And the kinds of transitions we see here are not narrative-based, action-based transitions. They're transitions from panel to panel that are non sequiturs in some cases, for example, the fish, but they can also be considered aspect to aspect transitions, which just means that from panel to panel you're being shown different aspects of a mood or a situation. So for me, these are feeling tones and liminal spaces we're exploring. Now this really comes out this liminality in the lower image, because in the lower image I have confounded the sequence. So I have started making connections, and you can see pipelines that cross the panels. The spaces in between the panels are known as gutters, but in this case we've got crowds filling the gutters, we've got pipelines, we've got shapes, we have panels that themselves resemble objects. So for example, there's like a barber shop pole with a candle on it. And so this is meant to have a sort of overall aesthetic journey that doesn't end up evaporating into a conceptual experience. So it's meant to make a dreamlike impression. And so the ways you can read it are several. We can flow through the overlaps, through the pipes, we can bifurcate, we can do a number of things. And so this, in a way, is a spell to open up a different kind of relationship to becoming, to time, so that it is not considered as if it were being railroaded down a singular track, but rather can move through this type of array. Now, let's look at a very traditional formal layout for a comic. So here we have the same size square panels in a 5x5 grid, and the idea is that you read it from left to right, top to bottom, and this actually tells a story that has a beginning, has a middle, has an end. But it's a story that's entirely abstract and figurative. And for those who are esoteric practitioners, this story is probably quite familiar. It's a picture of some textures and some singularities moving in different ways, developing different ways, mimicking a process of life and death, with an understanding of balance in the center, and that's what the feather is all about. But this is a comic about initiation, and it's quite conventional, and all the gutters you can see are totally clean. There's nothing in them, and the framing is there to support this traditional type reading. Now, these two images have a much more experimental approach to the way that the comic is structured. Now, it's still a comic in that you can move through it and experiences becomings and flows of time, and yet there are cases where you can really go in any direction you like. And the one on the right is actually a picture of everything I did on one particular day. And this isn't just everything I did physically, but also thoughts that I had, and I threw an I Ching hexagram at one point. And so it's this kind of blend or map of these various different moments, both virtual and actual. So I went through the city and I saw helicopters, and I thought about various different things, and just threw in some weirdness as well. The beauty of this for me as a practitioner is that this form of comic is also a journaling, and when I look at it, it will re-evoke the experiences that I had that day. So it can recover for me the presence of a particular moment in time. And on the left, of course, we have an image which is about a week's worth of these journals, that have come together into a single picture. And so in this case, I made less elaborate works for the individual days, but the whole came together. And so it was an experiment in shaping a whole week using these, we'll call them molecular techniques. The conventional method of reading could be considered a molar technique, using the language of Deleuze and Guattari as they introduced it in Anti-Oedipus and developed it in 1,000 Plateaus. But the latter example, the examples of the more, we'll call them rhizomatic or molecular comics, show that you don't necessarily need to read in these overcoated chunks, but you can move along various different lines of flight and various different avenues of exploration through this space, which is a record of days spent thinking and creating art. These two are similar examples of the same idea, and you can see these spirits have come up that represent contemplations, and there's also some runes were cast in the one on the right. This one's one of my favorites, and again, it's both mystical and parochial, and there are elements of day-to-day life, for example, coffee and exercise in the park and a game of chess, but there are also mystical and magical signs which refer to the kinds of contemplations that were going on, and also in general the overarching figures of the griffin and the demon as a type of dualistic influence, a kind of an emotional, shall we say, cadence that came out that particular day. So that's recorded in this piece. So it should be clear that these are spells and they shape time in different ways, and they form a sort of alchemy of contemplation that produces results. And those results are new ideas and new directions and new avenues in which to explore. And when we look at this particular piece, we can see that the low shoe, or the magic square of Saturn, appears. And this is something that later becomes pretty important in my experiments. So I'll show you some of those now. These are comics that were all made using the low shoe, the magic square of Saturn. And the way these were made is that I meditated to the point of calmness and allowed my imagination to show me what would appear in each of the panels. So I didn't underdraw or plan, I scried each panel. And this became something that I do quite a lot, scrying magical square. But in this case, you can read them in the horizontals, the verticals, and diagonals. The theme is tortoises, and this is an homage to the story of the low shoe being first discovered on the back of a giant tortoise by the legendary Yellow Emperor of China. The experiments with magic squares got extended in this particular piece, which is 16 panels. It's a 4x4 magic square known as the Dürer square because it actually appears in one of Dürer's prints, Melancholia, and it's a famous magic square. But what I've done is I've transposed the moments of a story that I wrote, and this is a bardic poem. Essentially, it's a 30-minute presentation that I gave at the Trans-States 2, but in this case the 16 key sections of that are mapped onto the magic square of Jupiter. So this becomes both a talisman and also a memory palace. The issue of hyperobjects. And I understand a hyperobject as a kind of concatenation of meanings that doesn't necessarily have a physical body, but has real effects in the world. And one of the most obvious hyperobjects is the calendar. So I've been building calendars since 2003. This is an image of my first calendar, which I call the Thoth count, which is based on the 88-day orbit of Mercury. Now, what I've done is I've scried each of the days, and I have a comic book that is non sequitur transitions, largely, or aspect-to-aspect transitions, which are the two types of transition that I favor, that show these different kind of evocative images that came to me after intoning the names of the 88 Enochian governors that are assigned to these particular days. So this is a calendar that is married to the Enochian system. The watchtowers of Enochian, there have 92 governors in total, but 4 of them are external to the set in some way, and there are 22 in each watchtower, which gives us 1 per element per major arcana of the tarot. So that's one of the reasons that the Enochian and the tarot have been married. So what we have here is a map of the Thoth count as a comic book, but this draws on this hyperobject, which is the impact of the calendar on time. Now, I mentioned the Castle of Birds earlier. The Castle of Birds is actually divided into 16 sections and 88 verses. So it also maps onto this same object, this same ripple impression on time, the pressure of art brought to bear on time. And this is the tip of an iceberg of complex structures that I've discovered that calendrics can avail of us. And so these structures can be used for memory palaces, for art, for timing in different ways, and for creating extensive interior semiotic systems, which I understand as being part of a practice of a growing intelligence and essentially a house of knowledge, a house of wisdom. So in a way, it's an illusory house, but it has real effects. Here on the left, we see one of the images of one of the governors that I scried, and on the right is an image of one of the 30 ethers, which I also scried independently on this particular magical structure, which I call the Magin Hive, which is a mathematical object with 9 rings, each of which has the sum total of 93, the magic sum of 93. And this is how I translate the governors into the ethers, and it represents how different aspects, different comics can ultimately refer to the same hyperobject. And following the scrying of the 88 days, I expanded it using the same methodology to create a 7-panel comic each day based off of the actual sigils of the governors. And you can see now how these all fit together to form what's called the watchtowers. There's 4 of them, and this is an example of the fire watchtower. So we have this set of puzzle-like comics that have all come together to form a large comic that can be read in multiple directions. Having accomplished this, of course, I was put in a position to go further with the techniques, and in this set of major arcana, which I completed with the help of lesser-known comics, indie comics company, I created a set of major arcana that have, you can see in the 4 corners of each card, there is actually the same sigils and a smaller version of the comic that I did for the large-scale watchtowers. And this is because there are 4 governors that we can assign to each of the 22 major arcana. So this shows how this technique can lead to a whole warren of semiotic tunnels, if you will, and reference the hyperobject. I actually used a Venus calendar, using the orbit of Venus to time the production of these trumps. The last set of techniques I'd like to show are manipulations of the topology of the comic itself. So comics on surfaces that have been set up in ways that produce different effects than if it was just on a flat page. So here we have a set of low shoe comics, as I discussed before, but these ones are nested, and there's a set of 11 envelopes that have on each side a low shoe, and these have been set up to mimic the structure of the tarot. So the idea is that you can place a sigil inside, ideally during a long-term working of one of these calendars, and this will house the intent in a kind of a shell of meanings. Here's a comic I made, which is 26 cells, each of which contains a impression or a scrying of the 26 letters of the English alphabet. And when this is studied and contemplated on, it provides rich imagery associated with each letter. And next I've gone on to map the letters onto the Rubik's Cube. This is a scrambled version, but when the cube is solved, the letters, if you look at them as numbers, A equals 1, B equals 2, C equals 3, and so on, form a mathematical, basically a magic object, a magic cube, where 8 rings each total 108. So the idea then is you use this comic as a type of tool for contemplating or ruminating on situations that puzzle you. You scramble the cube and then unscramble it as a meditation on clarification. So this is a ritual object married to a particular type of contemplative technique, but it is ultimately a comic book. And so now we can see that the comics or the cartoons are themselves magical objects, magical spells, ritual techniques. So the production is in service to the magical practice. A project here was quite ambitious. It was a set of comics on strips of paper that have comics on both sides arranged so that when you link them together and put a twist in them, a chiasm, you get a Mobius strip. So these are Mobius strip comics that continuously loop forever through a theme. And the 22 strips are, of course, the 22 major arcana of the tarot. So these were also produced one at a time in a meditative state. And the result is this chain, this comic chain. And what I wanted to do is create a portal through the tarot through which we could step directly. And so by turning each major arcana into a Mobius strip and then linking them all together, we get this paper portal. And when I first wore it, I realized this is like the wreath that appears in the Rider-Waite-Smith version of the World cards. So it really has quite a nice feel, and it is obviously a ritual object. And the act of creating it, the act of stepping through it, creates a memory and experience that is impossible without an object like this. So this is just an example of how stepping outside of even the page and manipulating the shape of the surface that the comics are inscribed upon is also part of a magical endeavor to have experiences and rare mental events that will allow us to think in different ways.
Is it possible, because you guys can't see, but Abraxas is, I think, you've got it on as well. So we're just going to try and switch you to the main screen, if that's doable.
Sorry. Losing the thread. There we go.
We can undo this maybe.
Abracadabra.
Fingers crossed.
There we go. Right, I just need to...
Fantastic. We can see, and you'll be able to wave to Abraxas here.
And speak. No? Ah, hang on. That should be working now. Hello, hello.
Perfect.
Wonderful. Hello.
Hi. And you're wearing your Mobius. Fantastic.
Yeah. I have the Mobile comic wreath.
Fantastic. I have questions, but does anybody want to open us up? Yeah?
You were talking about having like distinct points within the drawings, and I can see the Mobius strip and stuff there. So I was just wondering, had you done any non-linear comics where you can like completely rearrange it? Maybe with sort of I've seen some bits where you've got like you could do moving bits, especially with clever origami and stuff like that.
Do you mean, I'm not quite sure, I understand non-linear in the sense of being, like being dynamic?
So yes, as in like you can, I could see like the beginnings of it with the puzzle piece one.
Mm-hmm,
So, but so that it doesn't necessarily have just one shape, one finished form, but you can rearrange it to be different narratives, different objects.
I see what you mean. So, yeah. So physically manipulating it. I can think of almost like a tiling system where hexagons would be really useful for that, and you could create comics that would be arranged. I mean, in a sense, a tarot deck is that, right? You know, a tarot deck is very much like a set of sequential images that you can produce infinite combinations with, and then of course you find syntheses and stories out of that. So yeah, no, other than creating tarot itself, that's not something I particularly have done yet, but I'm very open to it. Yeah, it's a good idea. I grew up on Choose Your Own Adventures, and that was, I think, a major impact on my brain. And so I'm always trying to think how multiple possible timelines or vectors of choice can be found in these media that are typically driving us towards a single outcome.
Thank you. Yep, I think Jeff has a question. I have a question for both you and Jeff after Jeff has asked the question. Yeah.
Okay, great talk, Abraxas. I wanted to ask you about the glass bead games. You had a kind of a panel of that, which seems to be a reference to the Hermann Hesse, novel about the kind of like idealized game. What influence has that sort of had on your work, if any, and how did that play into your sort of contemplative exercises that you're expressing in that piece?
Yeah, that's a very key question. So Interestingly enough, I have read a great deal around Hermann Hesse's book, and I have read into it. It's interesting because the idea of this game, this play of I guess we can call it rich semiotic involvement, became somewhat, I would say I discovered Hermann Hesse after I already knew that was crucial. And I've come to the understanding that one of the responses that we need to make to a hyper-mediated culture is a deep enrichment of our own internal resources. And so that magic is a huge part of that, but it's more than just a return to a pre-modern understanding of magic. It's an understanding of magic that needs to embrace the ways, the kind of modular design thinking that we now are swimming in. And it comes down to, a friend of mine once said to me, our problem isn't information overload, it's filtered failure. And so what became of kind of crucial interest to me is this idea of how do we synthesize robust filters to withstand the kind of onslaught of information effulgence. Because the trouble is we're sitting under a waterfall with a teacup, and we've got so much information where knowledge has been substituted by access to information. So we've got all this information, but we have less and less knowledge because the apparatus that we use to store it has been dismantled to a great degree. So to me it was Dune actually that really sparked it. It was the Mentat myth. But when I encountered Hermann Hesse, when I realized, hold on, he had also he had really articulated this as a kind of a necessary pathway to deal with what's emerging. I was fully in accord before I even ever read it. But yeah, so I didn't give the name Glass Bead Game to that piece, but I fully endorse it because it's sort of what this is the great game, right? How do we safeguard? I'll call it fail-safe morality. How do we develop a fail-safe morality such that if the contingent systems of information and so on collapse or get leveraged by some kind of bad actor or whatever, we can still keep our human knowledge in-house? And that's, I think, essential. And it's sort of a neo-bardic way of preserving scientific and cultural heritage. Oralize it, basically. And that's it's the core of what I do.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm aware I'm now eating into some people's tea and coffee time, so I'm going to drop you an email with my question. Yes, and thank you all so much for sticking around for our session. Do continue the chats over a coffee and into the week, and thank you so much for joining us virtually as well. Keep chatting, keep talking, and have a really good afternoon. Thank you. Oh, wait here.